Hello, I'm Stacey Brewer of Hampton Blue. Thank you for joining me. At the time of this filming, it has been 20 years since the tragic events of September 11th, a day that started out normal. In fact, in New York, Arlington, Virginia, and Shanksville, Pennsylvania, it was a clear day, a beautiful day that turned dark. Thousands of people who were simply heading to work, traveling, or trying to save the lives of others would lose their lives that day. Much of it caught on camera. We didn't have smartphones quite like we do now, but we were heading into the social media era, where everyone now has a phone and can become an instant journalist and post their experiences, documenting every moment. MySpace will be founded 2 years later, Facebook 3 years later. That day we lost thousands of lives, but we must not also forget the aftermath. Many may have survived, but they are currently battling or may have even died years later from certain illnesses as a result of 9/11, particularly first responders, many of whom are battling cancer, respiratory issues, or PTSD. I was watching a documentary the other night on 9/11, and a chef who worked at the Twin Towers was describing how he escaped the tower and how at one point all he saw were bodies surrounding him. He could barely even get the words out. So the effects of 9/11 did not end 20 years ago. The effects are still being felt to this day. We also enter into a war where many soldiers lost their lives. As Americans, some of our privacy rights were altered. Stricter security measures had to be enforced at our airports. In fact, there was a time when friends and family could greet you at the gate once your plane arrived. Now they have to greet you outside. There was a time you did not have to take your shoes off or more during security checks. Now, in most cases, you do. Now you can only bring on 3 ounces worth of liquids. To some of you, this is your normal. But for those of us who remember a time pre 9/11, none of this ever feels normal. Today, I have with me a special guest who happens to also be my father. He will speak with you about that fateful day through the eyes of a senior officer of the Navy. At the time of 9/11, he commanded as an Admiral, Military Sea Lift Command, whose responsibilities include providing sea lift and ocean transportation for all US military services, as well as for other government agencies. Admiral Brewer, as Commander of Military Sea Lift Command, is known for overseeing the massive Military Sea Lift Command partnership with the private sector shipping contractors operation in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom, which involved moving over 20 million square feet of equipment to the Persian Gulf in less than 4 months. He is also known for leading the Military Sea Lift Command's disaster relief efforts after Hurricane Katrina. Retired Vice Admiral David L. Brewer III, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Stacy. I'm glad to be here.
Well, we're about to get into what we were doing that day. And like many people say, if you were old enough during that time to remember the significance of 9/11, you really remember where you were. For me, I was at Hampton University. I was getting up in the morning, as I always do, prepping for class. I believe it was about 8 a.m. I may have woken up. I had the news on as I normally do. I'm that kind of kid. I like to watch the news. And I may have had CBS on or the Today Show on. And at about 8:46-ish, 8:40-ish, they had reports about a plane hitting the Twin Towers in New York. So initially, I think the news and most of us thought it was just an accident, a freak accident. Even though it was a clear day, people were confused about, well, why would a plane hit the Twin Towers when it was such a clear day? But, at that moment, people just thought it was an accident, and they weren't even sure if it was a huge plane. They may have thought it was a small plane. And then, I'm still getting ready and prepping for class, to head to class. And less than maybe about 15 minutes later, I hear, oh no, from the news anchor. and it was a second plane coming into the Twin Towers. That's when we knew, oh, this was serious. This was not an accident. And of course, I'm in panic mode, but I was at Hampton, or in Hampton, Virginia, at Hampton University. So I was, hundreds of miles from New York. So I didn't necessarily feel immediate threat where I was. But of course, I felt for my country. And so, I started thinking, should I go to class? I don't know, what's going on. Of course, you're glued to the TV. And then maybe 30 minutes later, all of a sudden we hear the Pentagon was struck by an airplane. Now, I'm a military brat, and let's rewind a week prior to 9/11. I was in Washington, D.C. with friends. We were heading to the Hampton University versus Howard University game, where we battle it out every year to see who the real HU is. Of course, Hampton is always a real HU, but that's a whole other story. But we were heading to the game, and we're college kids. So my father drove us to Howard. And on our way to Howard, we passed by the Pentagon. And he just casually mentioned, oh, I have a meeting at the Pentagon next week. And I couldn't remember if he said Tuesday or Wednesday, but I remember it was not Monday. I just remember he said either Tuesday or Wednesday. And as we know, 9/11 happened on a Tuesday. And so I'm immediately in panic mode. I'm thinking my father is at the Pentagon. He had a meeting there. He told me that. He told me and my friends that. And I hadn't heard anything. My mother was at work. And of course, by this time, I'm not going to class. And it was hours later that I finally got a call from my mother letting me know everything was fine, because I was already panicking. I had already had to go outside and sit outside. A neighbor was looking at me, what's going on? I really thought my father was at the Pentagon, but luckily he was not. And, I don't want to be insensitive to others who have been waiting for a call from a loved one who did die that day. But, we were blessed that my father was okay. But Admiral Brewer, tell us what you experienced that day as a senior officer in the Navy, having our country under attack.
Well, Stacy, it was a harrowing day. I was sitting in a briefing in my command center, a classified briefing at the time, and my public affairs officer came in, Marge Holt, and said, Admiral, a plane just hit one of the Twin Towers in New York. So our initial reaction was the same as yours. Okay, well, oh God, what a terrible accident. 15 minutes later, she came in and said that a second plane hit the other Twin Tower. I immediately shut down the meeting, went up to my office. Now, my office is sitting on the Anacostia River, and down the Anacostia River, you can see the Pentagon. So then I was just sitting there watching the news, getting briefings. Next thing I know, bam, it hit the Pentagon, and I looked down the river, and I saw where the smoke was emanating from the Pentagon. And that's when they shut down the Navy Yard. And when they shut down the Navy Yard, we were in total lockdown. Nobody could leave, nobody could come in or out. And we sat there for over 5 hours like that until we could get the all clear that we could leave. That particular attack killed Lieutenant General Timothy Maud, who was your uncle Curtis Taylor's, one of his mentors. And he was the highest ranking general that had been killed since World War II. He was a 3-star general. It also hit the Navy Command Center. So one of the officers who worked for me Captain Jerry DeCanto, left his office, went to the command center, and was killed.
Oh my gosh.
He was one of the rising stars in our Navy. And so it was horrendous. And so one of the things that came out of it is that all of the, not to make this humorous, but we ran out of food
Mm.
because everybody started running on McDonald's on the base and everything else, and we were just out of food. And so as a result, I made a decision that from henceforth that we would have these things called meals ready to eat. And I stored those in my headquarters to make sure that if we ever had another disaster, that that was going to be what we would have. And as it turns out, I had a Canadian, we were an international organization. I had a Canadian officer on my staff, and he said, Admiral, I just want to let you know Canadians have the best meals ready to eat. They're gourmet. And
Oh
so I ended up with meals ready to eat from the Canadians. And
my.
so it was interesting. So, but in the meantime, after that, we started getting all these briefings. And that's when, of course, President Bush had a series of briefings, and he tapped the Navy and Special Forces to go after Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan,
Mhm.
and that's when we swung into action. We pumped, as you heard, we pumped. I I had all of the logistic ships, and we started pumping out. The Operation Enduring Freedom was a fuel war for me. I was pumping fuel to support the Air Force and the Navy in their refueling of all of the aircraft that were attacking Osama bin Laden and the terrorists and the Taliban in Afghanistan. And one of the things that we did was, between both wars, between Operation Rocket Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom, we were given the task of explaining that to the press. And Marge Holtz, brilliant woman, said, you can't tell them, well, we pumped, 15 million, 15 billion, or whatever number of gallons of fuel, because the average American can never understand that. I said, listen, I tell you what we're going to do. New York Times called. I said, this is the way it works, New York Times. We pumped 8 billion gallons of fuel during both of these wars. If you were to put that into the Empire State Building, we'll fill it 31 times. And that just went bingo. I mean, New York Times was all over that. They loved that analogy. Same thing with the million, you talked about 20 million square feet worth of combat cargo. Well, what does that mean? That's 950,000 SUVs. If you line them up bumper to bumper, they would extend from New York to LA all the way back to Vegas.
And you were in charge of all of that.
All of that. So that was what we were capable of doing.
The Afghanistan war, talks of that started to begin. So it was weeks after 9/11.
Right. But before that, let me make one other point before that, because I went to Ground Zero.
Yeah, and I wanted
Because,
you to talk about that, like your
okay,
experience.
so
Yeah.
the hospital ships we operated the hospital ships, the Mercy and the Comfort. Comfort is on the East Coast, Mercy is on the West Coast. So I got a call right after the attack from the Vice Chief of Naval Operations, Fox Fallon. Admiral Fox Fallon said, "Look, Dave, get the Comfort ready." I said, "Okay, fine." So I called up my merchant marines, my civil service merchant mariners who operate the ship, and then the Navy deploys naval reservists to man the hospital itself. These are the doctors, the nurses, etc. So within a week, we were able to deploy the Comfort to New York. But the lethality of the attack was such that there were no victims.
Mm-hmm.
So what we ended, it goes back to your point. The rescue workers, the firefighters, and all of the people that they actually brought in from outside of New York who went to Ground Zero to work, because Ground Zero that the devastation was horrendous.
And that's what I wanted you to really tell our
Right,
listeners.
right.
Explain that what that looked like to you, being
It
being
was it was like it was like a massive snowstorm from all of the ash and all of the debris. And when I went to ground zero, it was about 2 weeks afterwards. They were bringing in the families. Some of the families wanted to go there and see what was going on. And they gave them teddy bears to
Mm,
hug and hold on to because they were grieving. In
wow.
the meantime, as I was touring it, they found a landing gear in one of the other buildings that they had just discovered. There was also a fire still going on down in the subway system.
Mm,
And so it was still hot. This is a couple of weeks later. It was still hot down in there. So the place was still kind of dangerous, to be honest with you. But I had police officers escorting me, and they were still grief stricken. So one of them broke down and cried
wow.
during the tour because they had lost friends, etc.
Hmm.
But in the meantime, just before I left Washington D.C. to go to New York, I got a call from Montel Williams.
Who's the
Montel
former
called me up.
naval,
Yep,
former naval?
Montel, who was a naval reservist, and of course by that time he had his own show, the Montel Williams Show. Now Montel worked for me as a naval reservist in one of my previous jobs because he would go around and do presentations to school children, and we would schedule him to do that. So Montel said, Admiral, can I do a show on the Comfort? I said, sure. And so he did a show on the Comfort, and he was great because he spoke the Navy language, and he was interviewing the hospital staff, the chiefs, the lieutenants, the captain, etc. And so that was another piece to that. But to have witnessed that devastation, one of the things that came out during my visit that a lot of people don't realize is the collateral damage to all of the buildings around the Twin Towers. I mean, one building had its complete facade just blown up and knocked off.
Wow.
There were people who died on that side.
Hmm.
People died on the eating down in the plaza right below the Twin Towers because all that fuel and all that debris fell on top of them.
Hmm.
So the devastation wasn't just inside of the buildings; it was also on the ground. After that, I said, I knew right then and there that we were going to go to war, and somebody was going to have to pay for that because I mean there were some angry, angry people after that attack.
Exactly. And there's a lot of critique about us going to Afghanistan, but people have to remember during that time, we were angry. And you mentioned how, there was a lot of devastation surrounding the Twin Towers. And that may explain why, because a lot of people had questions as to why people did not leave if they could, the second tower that was hit. But there was a lot of danger and fuel hitting the ground after the first hit. So, they were trying to protect people even from that.
Yes, and that was one of the rationales for telling people to stay inside the second tower.
Yeah, exactly. That's what, yeah. Cause a lot of people said, oh, I would have left, or why did they, but it was really just danger surrounding the area. It wasn't like
Yeah,
you said, just inside.
yeah, absolutely.
So, it was just a devastating moment. So weeks after, as you mentioned, the Afghanistan war started to really take out the Taliban. And but then 2 years later, the Iraq war began, and you were a part of that war.
Yes,
That was about.
I normally had a fleet of about 120 ships, uh, what we call who were a part of our core. But then we went out and contracted other ships, including ships from the Brits after they had finished combat loading their ships and getting their troops in order. I ended up with 214 ships. Again, we did an analogy. We said if you were to look at if our ships were lined up between the United States and the Suez Canal, it would be one ship every 70 miles. That's how much combat cargo. But here's the backstory to that. Initially, the Bush administration, Secretary Rumsfeld, etc., did not say that we were going to war. But what they didn't understand is that the press watched us they watched military seat of command ships because they saw all of these helicopters and tanks and all these things rolling into Jacksonville, rolling into Charleston, rolling into Philadelphia, and these aircraft flying in. So again, Marge Holtz, God bless her, called up and told the DOD PL, I think her name was Tori Clark at the time. But anyway, she told her, she said, listen, y'all can't sit here and tell the press and the American public that you're not going to war when you're loading all of this equipment on our ship. She says the Judge Judy principle applies. Don't urinate on my leg and tell me it's raining. So Mars was a personality.
Yes.
And but she was correct. And so finally they got that message right. Because I mean, when I flew into Jacksonville and looked at, we had ships that could carry what we call our large, medium speed roll on, roll off ship. I had 20 of those. I mean, each one of those ships could carry out 3,000 Bradley tanks.
Mm.
And
Wow.
so these were huge ships, 3 football fields long.
Wow.
And here we are bringing them in. We're loading aircraft, we're loading tanks, we're loading trucks, and all these things. And then all of a sudden you're going to say, you're not going to war? You got to be kidding. So we basically got that message corrected. And so we launched. We were gone. And on March 20th, the balloon goes up. And and we were at war from that point on. I flew into, we offloaded into Ashwaba, which is in Kuwait, which is right below Iraq, and that's where the troops would fly their airplanes in, get off the airplanes. The equipment was combat loaded, so they would just basically fall in on top of their equipment and roll right into the war.
And I remember that time, again, watching the news. By this time, I'm in law school. And it was what shock and awe was happening. Is that
Yes,
what it was?
that's how I got started.
Right.
And so I flew into Iraq about 2 years later, 2 or 3 years, yeah, about 2 years later, yeah, about a year or two later. And when I flew into Iraq, I was on a Black Hawk helicopter,
Wow.
and I flew at treetop level because they wanted to make sure that no held SAM surface air missiles could hit us. And I actually flew in because we were trying to figure out if we could, because we had basically captured the southern part of Iraq, whether or not it was rather than putting ships into Ashwaba and Kuwait, whether or not we could go into Iraq. And the most humorous thing that happened to me then was that I had a guard on me at all times.
Yes.
And I went to the bathroom.
What? Where is this going?
and he was not with me.
Okay.
And he had a fit.
Oh,
He
wow.
says, Admiral, you can't go anywhere without me, including the bathroom.
So that's dangerous because you couldn't even go. That sounds like Coming to America's type stuff right there. You can't even.
Yeah, it was. I mean, he really got angry. He said, "Oh my God!" He said, "Where's Admiral? Where's Admiral?" He said, he's in the bathroom. He said, "Oh," and he goes running into the bathroom. And
oh
said,
my goodness!
You can't do this.
Wow. And I remember you wouldn't tell me a lot when you were going to Iraq because I was again nervous.
No, I didn't talk about it.
Yeah, because it wasn't obviously always safe for you.
Right.
Now, answer this if you wish, but did you agree with Bush starting the war with Iraq? Because there's a lot of controversy with that.
At the time, yes. At the time. But it has been years later that they determined that there were 2 premises for going into Iraq. Saddam Hussein was a bad guy, and his potential connection to Al Qaeda, which was Osama bin Laden, who attacked us. The other issue was weapons of mass destruction. And we did not want Saddam Hussein to have weapons of mass destruction because he was irresponsible. He's liable to not only attack his neighbors, he's liable to try to get a weapons of mass destruction into the United States and explode it, a dirty bomb, what we call a dirty bomb. Unfortunately, none of that really turned out to be true. History
revealed the truth.
Yeah, history revealed that none of that was true. Now, was it a good thing that we got rid of Saddam Hussein? Yeah, he was a bad guy, no
Yeah,
question about it.
he was a boogeyman for a long time.
Right. And we experienced that, you and I,
Yeah.
when I was the commander in Guam during Operation Pacific Haven.
Hmm.
When Iraq, if you look at Iraq at the time, it was three different areas of Iraq. You had the Kurds to the north, the Sunnis, which was the Ba'ath Party, which is Saddam Hussein in the middle, and to the south you had the Shias who were connected to Iran. So Sunnis, Saudi Arabia, and then the Kurds were sort of the natural adversaries of the Turks to the north. Well, Saddam attacked the Kurds to the north because they didn't like Saddam. And that's when we ended up with Operation Pacific Haven in Guam, and 4,000 Kurds ended up coming to Guam to be repatriated into the United States. And so that's when we kind of I understand, and we can get into the refugee piece later. That's when I really started understanding how the United States repatriates refugees and how they got them in. Because at that time we set up schools, we set up churches, we set up all these things for the Kurds so that they could live a good life once they got into the United States. And we took 4,000 Kurds and we put them in all 48 states. And of course, years later, one of the Kurdish kids who came into the United States via Guam called me. He wanted to go back to Guam. He wanted to see where he entered the United States. And I asked him how were they doing. He said it was rough when they first got here, but some of them had gone to college because money was provided for them to do all those things. So they were good people. Kurds are good people. So they were not the terrorist threat.
Right.
Okay. There was no terrorist connection to Kurds.
Yes.
Other than to the Turks. Now the Turks didn't like them, but that's another story.
And now we fast forward 20 years later, and President Biden has just ended the Afghanistan war. Do you agree with how he has done that? And as you mentioned, refugees, and we're trying to provide a safe place for some Afghanistan people, correct?
Yes.
So how do you feel about this process in current times?
Well, if the Afghans who are our allies and who helped us, especially, and you will see these relationships between the interpreters, the Afghan interpreters, and the people who were working with our forces. One of the things that we learn in the military is that there's a certain thing that we have, and that's loyalty.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't care what color you are, what your nationality is, there's a certain connection between us. And the soldiers who served with these Afghans in Afghanistan, some of whom who helped save their lives, there's a certain loyalty to them. That's why they fought so hard to get them back over here to the United States, because they know that the Taliban is going to kill them.
Mm-hmm.
And so within that context, yes, what the miscalculation was that the 300,000 Afghan forces were not going to fight. And so I think what we missed is the fact that they were all right fighting alongside of us when we were providing them with intel and providing them with air support and all those things. But once we left, that created this vacuum, and so therefore they folded, and they folded within 11 days.
Mm-hmm.
And so now you got the Taliban now control Afghanistan. So the question is, will terrorists begin to find a haven again in Afghanistan like they did 20 years ago?
Exactly. And that's where I've heard a lot of commentary on this. So ultimately, do you think was the war worth it? If
Well, Afghanistan, yes, because of we basically control Afghanistan. Now let's back up for a minute. Afghanistan is a tough place.
Mhm.
The Russians were in there, uh, and I always tell you, be careful who you call your enemy, because your enemy may be your friend one day.
Yes.
And we've seen that throughout history,
Mhm.
with the
Mhm.
Japanese now, our enemies, now they're our allies. The Germans were our enemies, now they're our allies. Well, guess who our ally was during the Russian invasion? Osama bin Laden.
Wow.
Okay. So,
Yeah. Right.
Then he flipped on us because I mean his whole agenda was he didn't like either one of us, but we were the lesser of the two evils between Russia and the United States. We were the lesser of two evils. So once he got rid of Russia, then he focused on us. So from '96 to 2001, he
Mhm.
built a terrorist network right there in Afghanistan because it's like the Wild Wild West in there. And so in essence, once that happened, then we go after him through Bora Bora and all of the attacks that we made. That was the right thing to do.
Mhm.
This guy had just attacked us, and we know it. We connected him to the attack. That we got right. The question was, should we have stayed and tried to keep the Taliban from coming back in, and should we have stayed and tried to change that country? Um, my position is, in order to change a country like that, 20 years is not long enough. So
Mhm.
you got to make, but we were at war in that country. Now, people go back and use the analogy of World War II and Germany and Japan, and we're still in Germany, we're still in Japan. Yeah, but we're not at war in either one of those countries.
Mhm.
We were at war in Afghanistan. We were losing lives. Would we have stayed in Germany and Japan if we were losing lives? I don't think so. Maybe, maybe not. But in order to change that culture, in order to change that country, you had to stay more than 20 years. Okay?
Mhm.
Change that country in 20 years. It's not going to happen. Now, have we stayed long enough to change it so that they can resist on their own? And my position on that is yes, because 20 years ago, you never would have seen women
Mhm.
protesting in the streets like you do now.
Mhm.
These women have tasted freedom, they have tasted empowerment. Therefore, they're going to be a problem for the Taliban, especially if we support them internationally like we should.
Yes.
And demand that the Taliban, if they want any kind of assistance or aid from anybody, make sure that you treat your women and empower your women and treat them fairly. None of this, no education, no jobs, none of that. That's medieval, and that's why we. This is a in many ways this is a war against democracy, freedom, etc. against medieval stuff that went on 1,000 years ago. These guys are still living 1,000 years ago. Can't do that.
Right.
World has changed.
The world has changed and still needs to continue to change, particularly when it comes to empowering women, and they're even further behind, which is
Right, and the Afghans here are going to support the Afghans there,
mhm.
and you better believe that there's going to be some money and some influence coming from the Afghans here as well as other places to support the Afghans who are left in the country. Now, Taliban is a very brutal regime, so they will beat, cut, behead, and do a lot of crazy stuff. So the question is, can we expose it? You made a very good point. 2001, we didn't have this thing called a smartphone.
Exactly.
Okay, so they will not be able to hide their brutality because of this.
Yes. Well, they'll probably try to block that
Well, they're satellites.
though. Right. Now, as you mentioned, the Taliban is brutal. And we already talked about how America has really changed since 9/11 in terms of, the security, and even some of our privacy has been altered a little bit, our privacy rights, as we remember what was it, the Patriot Act.
Yes. Mhm.
And so you can discuss more what you also see as what has changed since 9/11 in America. But my biggest question is, are we still as vulnerable to possible attacks from uh, people like the Taliban or whoever else? Or are we more secure?
We're more secure. There's no question about that because of the systems that we've put in place. You talked very, very extensively about the airport security.
Right.
But what has happened since 9/11 is the intelligence network. We are now much more connected in terms of our network of intelligence. And we also have, and you hear President Biden talk about this, we also have an over the horizon capability to attack pockets of terrorists. You saw that happen during the withdrawal, where all of a sudden a drone hits a vehicle that allegedly had explosives in it. There's still some controversy about whether or not it was indeed explosive laden. And so we didn't have that capability 20 years ago, and where a drone could come in and attack like that. Um, and that's some guy sitting in a command center somewhere looking at intelligence, and they launch a strike. And I think the Taliban and terrorists know that. We can take you out. Not only can we take that car out, we can take you out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Yeah.
Okay? And we can do it from afar. Now, is it better to do it that way than having boots on the ground? No. But we do have some capability to do those types of things. And so, no, things are different. Our intelligence is much better. We have allies with whom we're connected, and they're also involved in the intelligence network. So it's in everybody's best interest to make sure that we suppress terrorism and this whole medievalness. I call it medievalness that you see with the Taliban. We can't tolerate that. That cannot permeate the Middle East. It's time for the Middle East to become a little bit more progressive. Um, because there are certain parts of the Middle East I love. I'll be honest with you.
And I remember,
Bahrain,
yeah,
Dubai. I mean, Dubai is
fabulous.
it's just fabulous.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just amazing. Burj Al Arab, which is one of the best hotels in the world, is there. And I went to, I didn't stay there, but when I went, but because again, I had to go to the Middle East a lot during the war because my ships were throughout either getting repaired or refueling and doing all those things. So I had a chance to kind of travel throughout Bahrain, Dubai, etc. And it's just a fabulous place. I mean, all Middle East countries are not the same. And I think that's what people need to understand. They're different culturally. They're different, Sunni versus Shias, and they have sects of all of that in terms of the religions, etc. So some of them are very progressive, and Dubai is one of them.
Right. And that's really the story of many nations. A lot of times we like to just group everyone together, but there's always subgroups within a group. You
Yes,
have to really examine it really on an individual basis.
yes.
So, what are your final words to the victims of 9/11 as we're remembering them 20 years later? What are your thoughts for them?
Well, my heart bleeds for them, especially the children. There were children who were 2, 3, 4 years old who cannot recall their parents, who basically will grow up without the parent or parents.
Mhm.
My heart bleeds for them, as well as obviously I saw one couple who were very much in love, and her husband was taken from her, and she's still suffering.
Mm,
I think, remember what I said about the teddy bears.
yeah,
A lot of the victims' families had to have teddy bears in order to cope with this.
yeah,
And to those people, I say, hold on to each other and hold on to that quote teddy bear, and try to get through this, because it's tough to lose a loved one the way that they lost a loved one in such a senseless manner. And so my point is that my heart grieves for them. I grieve for them because I saw firsthand what that grief looked like when I went down to ground zero. And it's something that I will never forget. Never forget. And I will never forget my shipmates and General Moore in the Pentagon that you see behind me, in the memorial that you see behind me, and those sailors that died in the command center. I
mhm,
will never forget them because they were true heroes. And Jerry DeConto, in his inimicable way, the warrior that he was, he knew that when that plane hit, when that plane hit those Twin Towers, that he had to go down and do his job.
Mm.
And he went to the command center to do his job, and he was killed. And so to the DeCanto family, my deepest condolences 20 years later. To the Maud family, to Terry Maud, his wife, my deepest condolences. And all of the other 2,900 Americans who died, not only Americans, by the way,
Exactly.
that was an international hit.
Hmm.
That's my final point. When I looked at the people grieving at the World Trade Center, at the Twin Towers, one of my final thoughts was, I said, these terrorists have not just attacked America, they've attacked the world.
Exactly.
Because the nationalities of the people who were in those in the World Trade Center and in those buildings were from all different countries.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's why we had so much support for Operation Enduring Freedom, because the terrorists had literally attacked the world.
Yes. And I echo everything you just stated. And it's just a reminder of just how fragile life is and how we really have to cherish our loved ones while they're here. We never know what tomorrow will bring. And I continue to lift in prayer the souls of those who lost their lives that day. I continue to pray for the healing of their families and friends, and I continue to pray for the healing of those who are still plagued by the aftermath of 9/11. As I mentioned before, first responders, many of whom lost their lives due to various illnesses, and those who are still suffering from those illnesses, physical and mental. Well, thank you for joining us tonight. I would like to leave with a powerful quote from former President Barack Obama. It is about how we may honor all of those we lost. He stated in 2011, even the smallest act of service, the simplest act of kindness, is a way to honor those we lost, a way to reclaim the spirit of unity that followed 9/11. And remember, just a little bit of light can push away a lot of darkness. God bless.